In this video, we're going to talk about terms related to character. Let's start with main characters. There's the protagonist, which is just the main character in a work, and you can have multiple protagonists. You can have more than one protagonist, but let's just talk about that in the singular for now. And the antagonist is a character whose aims and goals oppose those of the protagonist. So notice the antagonist is defined in relationship to the protagonist. What that means is, while you can have a text that has multiple protagonists, you will have at least one, generally speaking. It would be a really unusual, highly experimental work not to have a protagonist in it. But you don't necessarily have to have an antagonist. It's very possible to have a text without an antagonist. But when you are looking for the antagonist, what you want to think is, okay, who's the protagonist? What are they trying to achieve? And then see if there are any characters who are opposing that. And then that will help you find the antagonist. So notice we're using these terms, protagonist and antagonist. We're steering clear of hero and villain. So I wanted to just address that really quickly. When you think about hero, you think about someone who comes in and saves the day. It's got a whole bunch of specific cultural connotations to the notion of hero. And a protagonist is not necessarily that. A protagonist does not have to be a character of high moral value or self-sacrificing nature or any of those things that we think of when we think of a hero. So that's why we're going to stick with the neutral term protagonist, and it simply means the main character in a text. Similarly, keep in mind that the antagonist is not necessarily a villain. Certainly, the protagonist and antagonist are in conflict, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the protagonist is the good guy and the antagonist is the bad guy. So just keep that in mind, and let's use these neutral terms of protagonist and antagonist rather than hero and villain. Okay, so let's think for a minute about minor characters. Obviously, these are characters who are not the main focus of a text, but that doesn't mean that they aren't important. They can play significant roles, even though those roles may be limited. So when you're analyzing a minor character, what you want to do is ask yourself, what is the function of this character? Why is this character being introduced? What is it that they're doing? That's often a good way to get at minor characters in analysis. A good example of an important minor character is a foil character, and that's a minor character who contrasts specific traits in a main character and thus emphasizes those traits. And we'll certainly see some foil characters in some of the texts we're going to look at. Okay, let's talk about some character traits. There are a few pairs of terms we're going to go over here. The first is round and flat. Round characters, and I'm giving you the definition from the critic who first coined this term, are characters who are capable of surprising in a convincing way. So they're complex characters. Flat characters, on the other hand, are characters who do not undergo change during a narrative. But those flat characters are not necessarily aesthetically ill-drawn characters. That's really not a derogatory term, though it has been interpreted that way sometimes. But when you identify a character as a flat character, it simply means that they do not undergo change. They're consistent through the narrative. Again, you want to think then, okay, so what's the function of this character? Now notice, even protagonist characters can be flat. It's very possible to have a consistent protagonist. So it doesn't mean even that they're minor characters if they're flat characters, or that they're major characters if they're round. These two sets of terms, major, minor, and round, flat, are independent of each other, and they can map across those categories. So again, round and flat are just ways of talking about the degrees of complexity, and again, giving us some language for character analysis. Okay, so how do round and flat compare to static and dynamic? This is a question that's posed in your textbook reading. So dynamic characters change, right? We understand what the term dynamic means. It means something changes, and so in this case, we're talking about characters. So this is often true, that round characters are dynamic, but not always. Complex doesn't necessarily mean that you have to change. Static characters do not change. So flat characters are also static characters. Those two things do go together. Round characters, though, may also be static, like we talked about. So you could have a round protagonist who is nonetheless a static character consistent through the text. A bonus term here, epiphany. So an epiphany, I'll give you a hint. It's a sudden moment of self-realization. So characters who experience an epiphany are dynamic characters, right? Because that self-realization, that is a change. So because characters have undergone that, they are dynamic. Not all round characters experience epiphanies. Like we talked about, round characters don't necessarily have to be dynamic, okay? But if you do have a character who experiences an epiphany, that's definitely a dynamic character. And again, this is just one type of change. This is a sudden change. There can also be a more gradual change over time. Okay, let's talk for a minute about some common character types. One is the stock character. And those are familiar, recurring types that are readily recognized. When we're talking stock characters, we're talking specific cultural and historical contexts that enable us to recognize those characters. So for example, you recognize the damsel in distress or the mad scientist. These are specific types of characters that when you see even just sort of visual elements that are related to them, or descriptive elements that are related to these types of characters, you can almost fill in the rest in terms of what these characters are like. So those are stock characters. There are also archetype characters. And these characters are recognizable across time and culture, and they fulfill specific roles. So what I mean is, the role is what is important, and the actual specifics of the character that fulfills that role may be quite different. And again, that may be and will be important in the specific cultural context. But the character itself, the role that they're playing, is an archetypal role. So, for example, the trickster is a common type of character that functions in all kinds of narratives across all kinds of times and cultures. But the individual tricksters themselves are different. I have some examples here, right? These are all very different. I've got Loki, Tom Sawyer, that's Puck from Shakespeare, that's the one you might not be as familiar with, and Fred and George from Harry Potter. All of these are trickster characters, and they're very, very different characters, but they're all fulfilling this recognizable role. And so that's what makes them part of this trickster archetype. Finally, let's talk about conflict. So we've been talking about individual characters and character traits, and you should definitely be able to identify those, and those terms can help you analyze character. But characters often exist in relationship to each other. There are lots of different ways to talk about and describe the relationships between characters. One way of thinking that through is in terms of character conflict. So we talked about already the protagonist and antagonist, and that those two characters are necessarily in conflict because, you know, that's inherent in the definition of an antagonist in relationship to a protagonist. That would be a good example of one of the types of conflict we're going to talk about here. And the two we're going to talk about are internal and external. So the protagonist-antagonist example would most cases be an example of external conflict, another character that's sort of fighting against and trying to thwart you. Internal conflict, obviously, that's something where a character is dealing with their own demons or a problem in their own mind and working that through. So those are just two types of conflict, and that's just one way of relating of talking about relationships among characters and character traits. You can use these terms, and that can help you to analyze those characters, but you also want to think through how those characters are functioning in their specific context.